Greetings, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for our Prevention Speaks web chat with author Susan Freinkel, author of Plastic, A Toxic Love Story. We're really excited to have Susan here with us today and to have all of you listening in. I suspect a couple of people are still getting themselves logged in and sorted out with all of the software and stuff, but we'll go over just a few technical details while we're giving folks that time to do that. So I've gotten some confirmation that sound is broadcasting, which is good news, and I hope everyone on the line can hear me. I would say if you can't hear me, please let me know, but I guess you won't know to let me know, so a little bit circular right there. I'm sure folks will let us know some way if they're not getting any sound. So we are conducting this via live broadcast, which means no one should need a telephone to hear us. It should be coming over your computer speakers or your headphones, and everyone who was signed up early got a message from me letting you know that that was the case. It also means that while you can hear us speak, we actually can't hear you speak. So we'll handle questions throughout the conversation and afterwards via the chat function. So you can see the picture there on your screen. There is a very narrow green bar at the middle top of everyone's screen, and if you scroll over that, you don't have to click, but if you scroll, it pulls down, and you'll see the button for chat. So that should give you the little box on the right-hand side of your computer that lets you communicate with us, and we can also communicate back with everybody either as a group or individually. So feel free to send questions here as you're listening to the conversation and something pops in your head, and then we'll open it at about 1/4 to either 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock as it is.
Quarter to the hour.
Right. For you to toss in some questions as well. So I think with that, we should pop in and get going. What do you think?
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's just start off with a whole book on plastic, right? A whole book.
Yeah.
What inspired you to jump in and start talking about this particular issue?
I live in San Francisco, and at the time that I started thinking about this book, there was a lot of discussion about plastic bag. There was debate over plastic bags. There was some talk about chemicals in plastics. But I'm a journalist, and I was looking for a book topic, and I was looking to write. I had written a book about a very small topic previously, and I was looking to expand that. And I'd always admired Fast Food Nation because I felt like he took this thing that was, invisible but omnipresent and showed how much it had affected modern life. And it occurred to me one day that plastics was a similar kind of story. It was something that was just everywhere that we look, everywhere that we live, and really, really makes a difference in the fabric of our lives and sort of fundamentally changed the fabric of our lives.
Excellent. So were you surprised that you could fill a whole book, or?
I could have written, not that I would want to, but I could have written 2 or 3 books. I mean, I only really scratched the surface. There are a lot of things I never even looked at in plastics. It is the transformational material of the 20th century, of modernity. So, no, I wasn't surprised.
Okay. Wow. Excellent. Because I think I was a little bit surprised to pick it up and really find so many stories.
Yeah.
And I love the device that you used throughout where you picked, like, some pivotal items to tell.
Thank you.
To tell the story around that and how things had changed. So how long did it take you to research the book, and how many different locations did you visit?
I spent about 3 years working on the book, which in book life is actually fairly short. And I traveled a lot. I went to China to follow the production chain of a Frisbee. I went to the Gulf Coast of Texas to visit a polyethylene plant. I looked at recycling plants in China as well. I went to plastics conferences in Wisconsin, also again in Texas, a recycling conference. I went to Leominster, Massachusetts, which was like the cradle of early plastics, and where the celluloid industry, one of the first commercial plastics, took off. And there used to be there a National Plastics Museum. The museum, sadly, is now defunct. It doesn't exist anymore. I don't know, a fair number of places.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah.
So kind of everywhere.
as well, as many places as I could get to.
So, let me see, we are going to switch some slides out because my next question for you is, what are some of the most revolutionary items made of plastic?
Oh, okay. Well, this first slide, just to let you know, was when I started the book, I decided I would spend a day going without plastic, and that quickly became apparent that that was impossible when I walked into the bathroom that morning and looked at my plastic toilet and toothbrush and sink and so forth. And then I spent a day writing down everything that was plastic, and I was sort of staggered by the size of the list.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually an expanded list, but it just, if you take a quick glance at it, you see how many parts of our lives are plastic. And now you would ask me about sort of revolutionary materials that are plastic, and I sort of think about, when you say revolutionary, you think it's going to be these, gee whiz, really cool space age types of things. But one of the things that's fascinating to me about plastics is that you're talking about it affecting, really just the way we live, everyday
mm-hmm.
life.
Mm-hmm.
So combs, this is here because in the early plastics were made out of sort of scarce luxury materials like ivory, mother of pearl, tortoiseshell. And when plastics came along, they replaced that. They could imitate those materials and they could replace them in things like combs, which was a really profound change. I mean, it meant that things that had been costly and really only available to wealthy people, you could now get facsimiles of those even if you weren't rich. So the early plastics really kind of democratized consumption. So that was a big change. The phone. This is a phone made of bakelite for synthetic, really completely synthetic plastic. Imagine, I guess you could make a phone out of wood, but you'd be hard-pressed. And again, plastics are they also became the basis for the electrical industry. Bakelite, the plastic that phone was made of, is also a big electrical insulator, and it really allowed the country to wire up. I love this ad, cellophane ad. Cellophane, of course, was one of the sort of early packaging plastics. And, packaging, if you think about, again, how much stuff is packaged now, plastics really revolutionized, made possible packaging, which in turn, arguably makes possible a much broader, bigger, wider food supply chain. About a third of plastics goes into packaging.
Wow.
Nylons. Nylon was invented in the 30s, sort of the answer for centuries long effort to create a synthetic silk. Nylon was one of the first big synthetic materials, but then, you have, this is from a 1953, I think, Sears catalog, all of these new synthetic fabrics, which, made possible wash and wear fabrics. And, we continue to have synthetic fabrics, whether it's Gore-Tex or lots of different things. You end up with, spacesuits, which a lot of synthetic fabrics went into spacesuits. Records, vinyl LPs. I don't know if people are old enough to remember them, but I do.
They're back in, right?
They're cool again.
That's the way to go.
The first vinyl LP, vinyl was used to replace sort of fragile shellac on albums. That discovery or that advance was made in the 30s, although the first vinyl LP didn't come out until after World War II. But, recorded music. So, now you get it on tape, then you have it on CDs, and of course I'm not even talking about film, the film industry, which would not exist but for plastic. Plastics revolutionized medicine. This is one of the first kidney dialysis machines. It was made by a guy named Willem Koff, who put it together in Nazi-occupied Holland, and he used cellophane as one of the filters. And, we'll come back to the issue of medicine, but plastics really, really revolutionized medicine. So,
very cool.
Yeah.
So are we jumping ahead, or are we ready
we can jump ahead. We can
Okay.
jump ahead to medicine.
So, how have plastics affected healthcare in terms of, I'm thinking about the blood banks, and then there's this interesting quandary that you talk about in the book of some plastic additives that are problematic in terms of some health effects, but also have this amazing side effect of preserving blood. So can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Well, so, I mean, you couldn't, let me just go back for a minute and say you could not have medicine without plastic, which is, of course, a point the plastics industry repeats ad nauseum. When I spent time in hospitals, I suddenly realized I was in the most plastic environment I could imagine, besides maybe a preschool. Plastics, from the most mundane things, bedpans, Band-Aids, to, very sophisticated machinery. One of the devices that I talk about is the blood bag, which blood was originally contained in, this is not a great picture, blood was originally contained in glass bottles. Lots of problems with that. In the 50s, this Boston surgeon, Carl Walter, figured out that he could take a new plastic vinyl and put blood in that, and it was fabulous. It just absolutely revolutionized blood banking. It made it possible to separate blood because you could connect these plastic bags. You could, separate the components of blood. You could hang a bag and have it work. You could squeeze from it. You could get more units from it than before, and you could do this all hygienically. Problem is, as later was discovered, is that there's a plasticizer used in that vinyl, a phthalate, which leaches out into the blood. And I know we're going to come back to that, but there are potential health effects associated with that plasticizer, but it is also a very good preservative for blood cells. It helps blood cells last longer. So blood bankers do not want to give up vinyl blood bags containing this phthalate because it works really, really well. And that's kind of one of the stories with plastics. That's sort of one of the themes of our plastic life, is that with many of the benefits that plastics bring comes these problems and these dark sides, and we have not managed those two very well or figured out how to exploit the benefits without getting the downsides.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So what were some of the early warning signs that plastics had some of these problematic attributes, and was that mostly in the medical field, or?
Well, I was actually surprised when I was writing the book to realize that a lot of the controversies around plastic today, we've seen them before. They've been up, there was concerns about pollution going back to the 70s. First reports of plastics in the ocean go back to the 60s. People realized, plastics went into medicine because it was presumed these materials were inert. But even in the 40s, even as they were starting to go into medicine, there were early warnings that actually substances were leaching out of them. And in fact, there was these researchers did this study in the 50s where they, I don't quite understand how they did this, but they were wrapping rat livers, living livers of rats, in various plastics, and they found that the ones, they were finding that the rats that had plastics on the liver were getting a lot of tumors, a higher rate of tumors. They didn't know why that was. So, as early as the 50s, it was clear that plastics were not as inert as people had thought. On the plastic vinyl in the blood bag story, that realization came in 1969 when these Johns Hopkins researchers were doing work where they were trying to perfuse rat livers, and they were using blood bags and IVs, and they were finding that the results kept screwing up, and at a certain point they realized that there was some compound that seemed to be screwing up the results, and they eventually traced it back to this plasticizer that was coming out of the vinyl, because this particular plasticizer leaches out very easily. It's not kind of chemically bonded with the plastic. And they started looking around. They found actually they were finding presence of this plasticizer in people who had blood transfusions and in stored blood. And then in 1972, researchers, different set of researchers at the National Lung Heart Institute, found traces of this plasticizer in the blood of people who weren't medical patients, just people who use vinyl in their everyday life, watered their yard with a vinyl hose or, you know, had vinyl flooring or whatever. And they found that those people all had trace levels of this phthalate called DEHP. Was it a problem? Nobody really knew. In those early studies in the 70s, people went looking for sort of classic toxic effects. And they weren't seeing, you know, they found that at very high doses it could induce problems in rats, but through a mechanism that didn't really affect humans. They didn't seem otherwise to be any sort of significant health problem associated with it, so people just kind of moved on. Okay, we know that it leaches, but it leaches, this chemical is leaching out at very small amounts, so nothing to worry about. And that was kind of where the field sat until the 90s.
So really it was this assumption that the dose makes the poison, and if the dose isn't high, we aren't even going to ask the question, in essence.
Right.
So tell me about, you're writing your book about Theo Colborn and endocrine-disrupting compounds, and she calls these endocrine-disrupting compounds, which we talk about a lot. So many folks listening in on this will be familiar with this concept, but she called them hand-me-down poisons.
Right.
So what's her story, and why would she call endocrine-disrupting compounds hand-me-down poisons?
Well, she's a fascinating person who started out as a rancher and a pharmacist, and then got concerned about rivers in Colorado where she lived, and decided to start looking at, get a degree in freshwater ecology. And she started looking at the whole issue of pollution in rivers, and got hired to do this study of pollution in the Great Lakes. And she started sort of compiling all this data on wildlife in the Great Lakes, and started seeing these really kind of weird things happening that not sort of the expected, just straightforward deaths, but sort of stranger things. You know, male gulls who had female cells in their testes, female gulls who were nesting together, cormorants with weird, you know, crossed bills. And when she started putting together all this data, what she realized is that a lot of the symptoms that she was seeing were symptoms that would be mediated through the endocrine system. They were things that could be caused by something going wrong in the endocrine system, which sort of controls growth and development and sexual maturation and so forth. And then she started seeing a couple of disturbing, strange things in the data as well. She started seeing, for one thing, that the wildlife that was affected were top predators, so something was coming up through the food chain. That it wasn't the animals who had been directly exposed to things like PCBs or DDT, it was their offspring. So whatever was going on seemed to have some transgenerational effect, which is why she called them a hand-me-down poison. The adults had been exposed, but it was the offspring who were showing these weird developmental problems. And that was a really different, that sort of led to a really different way of thinking about how toxins and poisons might work. She wasn't the first person to discover that. I mean, people had seen that in DES earlier. They'd seen that in some of the DDT research. Rachel Carson.
Passage of time.
Right. But she wasn't seeing it, you know, DES, where mothers who took the drug, but their daughters and their sons were the ones showing the effects years and years later. That was out-and-out hormone. She was tracing these kinds of effects to chemicals that were not designed as hormones, but seemed to be acting in a hormone-like fashion.
So there's a lot of serendipity here. People are discovering these things, leach accidentally, and then this one researcher is seeing these patterns kind of by her observational skills, not because these effects were looked for in the creation of these products.
She wasn't the only one. There were other researchers too, but yeah, she had a genius for sort of taking huge, you know, mind-numbing quantities of data and being able to pull out patterns. And then she convened this conference in 1991, I think it was, where she brought together all of these people from different disciplines, you know, zoologists, biologists, anthropologists, you know, toxicologists, people who didn't normally talk to each other. and she sort of literally, put them in rooms together over a weekend and forced them to just keep working at it and talking to each other. And by the end of the weekend, it became clear that all of them were sort of seeing pieces of this puzzle. All of them had been picking up little pieces of it, but hadn't realized that there was this larger pattern. And the larger pattern seemed to be that there were these synthetic compounds out there that were disrupting the endocrine system in one way or another.
So you really needed all of those disciplines to come together to see the patterns in the picture emerge.
It helped. Yeah. And they were the ones who sort of then called this phenomenon endocrine disruption.
Fascinating. So endocrine disruptors can challenge logic and behave in these kind of astounding and paradoxical ways. So can you describe some of the endocrine disruptors that we might hear about a lot and how they might behave in ways that have challenged assumptions about chemical toxicity? And while we're setting up, I'm going to move the phone and have you move that up and over your head so it's in front of us, just so that folks can maybe hear us a little bit better.
Okay.
So they're all watching us rejigger our organization here. So tell us a little bit about endocrine disruptors, and I can toggle us through.
Okay, well, let's, endocrine disruptors, let me sort of talk generally about them. There's a lot of different chemicals, lots of different chemicals, and the count really varies depending on who you talk to. I've seen, 70 to 1,000 or more. But what they do is they act on the endocrine system, and they can act on sex hormones. Those are the best known ones. But they might act on growth hormone or thyroid hormone, or, some people say don't call them endocrine disruptors because we even are now seeing effects on neurotransmitters. Probably the poster child for all of this is bisphenol A, BPA. And BPA was unusual in that it was actually created as a kind of estrogen. People were hoping to use it for birth control. It didn't work very well. And it basically found its way into the polymer industry, and it was used to make polycarbonate plastic, which is that hard, clear plastic that, once upon a time, Nalgene bottles were made of, or baby bottles. It's also used to make epoxies, industrial glues. And it's found in bottles, it's found in can linings, it's now found, people have discovered that it's on thermal paper receipts. And the main way that bisphenol A works is it mimics estrogen in the body. You take it in, and it looks molecularly like estrogen, and it can lock into the estrogen receptors. And so it can prevent estrogen from natural estrogen from going to those receptors, from firing those receptors. It can cause the body to reduce the amount of estrogen it produces. And in animal and cell studies, we've seen impacts on the breast, ovaries, prostate, thyroid, heart, brain development, insulin production, and behavior. These are, not human studies. Humans, figuring out what it does in the human body is tough because although, biomonitoring shows that we all have, virtually all of us have levels of estrogen, of BPA in our bodies, it washes out quickly, and it's very hard to sort of do a controlled experiment with people. But epidemiological studies have found correlations with a lot of different kind of chronic health conditions, including heart disease, obesity, diabetes, breast cancer, prostate cancer, ADD, and you wouldn't be surprised. Some of these are, particularly like breast and prostate effects, these are places that are mediated by estrogen and affected by estrogen.
So it biologically makes sense.
It biologically.
These particular systems, right?
Right.
When the Institute of Medicine report on breast cancer in the environment came out a year ago, they talked about this term biological plausibility.
Right.
And this illustrates that very clearly, that it's biologically plausible. It makes complete sense that BPA would act the way it does, given what it activates and its shape. So. Exactly.
And, it's very hotly debated, but the Society for Endocrinology, which is hardly, the sort of fringe, wild-eyed movement, a year or two ago came out with a statement saying they were concerned about the potential effects of bisphenol A at low doses. The one that I write about more in my book are phthalates. And phthalates are sort of a family of chemicals that are used really widely. They're used as plasticizers, they're used as lubricants, they're used as solvents. You find them in inks, you find them in dyes. There's about 25 different phthalates. The ones that are most common, though, are, I just realized I misspelled that, are these 6. That top one, DEHB, is probably the one that is most worrisome because it seems to have the strongest impacts and it is really, really widespread, mainly as a plasticizer for PVC. And that's just, these are very partial lists of things. So unlike BPA, DEHP works on testosterone. If you go to the next slide, I think. It interferes with the way testosterone is produced. It interferes with the way that testosterone connects to cells receptors. And in animal studies, it's literally at high doses, it's literally toxic to the testicles. The question is, what does it do at low doses? And, these are some of the effects that they've seen in animal and cell studies. There is, at a high dose, it produces these sort of changes in the male reproductive system that have come to be called the phthalate syndrome. And there is some suspicion that at low doses, it can sort of produce paler versions of that. Again, you have the problem with human studies. We can't subject humans to the sort of, controlled research of animal studies, but epidemiological studies have found correlations. People with higher levels of DEHP in their system are more likely to have some of these kinds of effects. And there actually were 2 real-time human studies. A scientist named Shanna Swan has been following a group of women. She measured the DEHP levels in the women when they were pregnant, and then has been following their sons. And she found that when the boys were infants, she looked at them really systematically and found that they had something that's called a shorter anogenital distance. That's the space between their anus and the base of their penis, which is something that you see in rats who have been exposed to high levels of this stuff. It's a marker for kind of disturbed testosterone production, and in the rats, it's associated with problems like infertility later in life. She went back to these kids when they were 5, when they were in preschool, and she decided to look at the way they play because there's some evidence that when you block testosterone, when they've used like chemotherapy drugs that block testosterone in rats, it changes the way the male rats behave with each other. And she found that the boys whose mothers had the highest levels had played, it was less masculine play. They were less likely to be the boys who were out there, wrestling or, tossing the ball around. They might be more drawn to puzzles or to make-believe games. They weren't, it's not like they were, these were subtle effects, both the change in their this anogenital distance and this play behavior. They're very subtle effects, but they spoke to the idea that they actually may have had some change or disturbance in the testosterone, and the danger is that that's going to have downstream effects as they age on various parts of their bodies. So there's a lot of controversy about these endocrine disruptors, and part of the controversy is that the classic toxicology tenet is that, the more you're exposed to something, the more likely it's going to cause harm. The dose makes the poison. These chemicals don't act that way. These chemicals seem to have effects at very, very low doses, and they seem to have effects in a different way than classic chemicals. So this is basically those things that say monotonic curves. That's sort of the classic way a chemical or a toxin works. You start out really small, and as the dose goes up, you see a bigger effect. These non-monotonic curves are what are throwing a lot of scientists off because, here you've got sort of the highest effects perhaps at very low doses, or you see the strongest effects at very low doses. You could start out seeing an effect at a very low dose, and then you go to a high dose and nothing happens, which is, in fact, there was just a paper published on DEHP, which was what they actually saw, that, tiny amounts seem to have impact on testosterone, and the big amounts didn't. That's not the way toxicology is supposed to work. That's the way hormones work, though. And the people, some of the people who have been doing the work on BPA and DEHP and other endocrine disruptors say this makes a lot of sense if you think about these as being hormones.
Because our body's own hormones are working at small amounts.
Very small amounts.
Making the profound kinds of changes we see at puberty or
right.
as the breast prepares to lactate during
exactly.
pregnancy, right?
Exactly.
It's not big amounts that
it's
make
not
that
big amounts.
cascade of events.
It's very small amounts, and and what they also are finding is it's small amounts at certain critical points of development. So if a fetus is exposed to BPA, this is what rat studies, for instance, show that during particular critical windows of development, just 1 or 2 days can make a difference on whether it's going to affect how a cell develops down the line. If you miss that 2-day period, you may not see any effect whatsoever. Maybe the same dose, but it may not have any effect because the cellular changes have already taken place.
So that can make it hard to test for some of these effects, right? Because they're used to, in toxicology, testing at high levels and inferring, that if you test here, here, and here, and I'm so glad we have the video, you've got a straight line. But if that straight line continued like this and you haven't measured down here, you don't see that non-monotonic curve, right? You don't see that there's also a high effect happening over here, and you have to kind of know what timing you want to focus on in the prenatal period or prepubertal period to know when it matters.
And what complicates it even further is you don't necessarily know all the endpoints that you're looking for. So, the timing that is going to make a difference, say, in, how, I'm not a scientist, but how, one system is developing may be different than the timing that is involved in another system. And because these act like hormones, because these, affect so many systems in the body, it's very hard to establish, which one are you looking at? And that's one of the reasons. I mean, there's been a lot of debate over whether, whether concerns about these chemicals are warranted. It's very, very hard to establish, what you are looking at that would show, say, it has a metabolic effect might be a different period of development than what you're looking at to show that it is going to affect infertility, say, or, breast cell development.
The risk complexity, which fascinates all of us here, actually a lot as we watch the science evolve. So how do you think that these uncertainties play into policy debates and how industry behaves with regard to these endocrine disrupting compounds?
Well, the uncertainty has, I think, been something that industry has exploited. I mean, let me be clear, there is true scientific debate over just what these compounds mean. There are independent scientists who have looked at BPA and have looked at the rat model, say, and then, they've tried to apply that in primates and haven't seen the same results. And so there's genuine uncertainty here. But industry has used that uncertainty to argue that these chemicals are safe. One of the things that's sort of a classic tactic, I think, that the American Chemistry Council has used is they attack each individual study. They attack the epidemiological studies and say, well, just because it shows there's a correlation between maternal levels, mother's levels of BPA and, obesity in somebody, that's not proven cause and effect, and it's not. They're right. But that's kind of the gold standard for looking and discerning public health problems. So they sort of nitpicked the studies, and that also then obscures the fact that you have an emerging big picture going on. you know.
So you can nitpick an individual study. Every study is going to have
Every study.
a set of methodological limitations. But when you talk about the Endocrine Society coming to a conclusion that there are concerns about BPA, that happens when they look at the whole body of literature, right? And if you have controlled animal studies suggesting an issue and human epidemiological studies suggesting a correlation, you've kind of built a pretty strong foundation for concern.
You've built a strong foundation for concern. You haven't connected all the dots. And, you know, everybody agrees the dots need to be connected, but it does build a strong basis for concern. That was the way the case was made against cigarettes. You started with, you know, cell studies and animal studies and epidemiological studies, and it took 40 years to actually sort of finally create the full picture of how exposure to cigarette smoke leads to lung cancer. And all along the way, the cigarette industry, big tobacco, was saying, you know, nitpicking and pulling apart and you know, picking at the larger picture. And, you know, that strategy people have called, and the industry itself acknowledged that they were, in industry memos, tobacco industry acknowledged that they were using a deliberate strategy of manufacturing doubt. And I think the chemical industry has played that same strategy in dealing with the debate over some of these chemicals.
You have questions you want to answer in the science, but industries maybe exaggerated some of those uncertainties or questions to their...
They've exaggerated them. I mean, it gets very complex because, you know, you get issues like what kind of rat model are you using? There are more estrogen-sensitive rats and less estrogen-sensitive rats. You get questions about the size of the studies. Independent researchers don't have the money to mount huge studies. And then you have these big weight of evidence studies which tend to have larger numbers and have often had smaller, you know, have not had the same results as the sort of, you know, have seemed to exonerate some of these chemicals, but, you know, are usually done by industry. There was one study that looked at, this was several years ago, but they looked at all the BPA studies and found that, you know, of the something like 119 studies on BPA, you know, 11 showed that, you know, suggested that the compound was safe, and all of those were industry funded. You know, there are a lot of methodological differences in how to do that, and you know, again, there's reasonable and you know, scientifically valid reasons for differences, but there is also sort of patterns in how the independent research tends to show there's cause for concern, and the industry-funded research tends to get a different answer.
That makes it difficult for policies and markets to know how to respond to that body of research. So,
and you're not going to get certainty. I mean, that's the problem, is that we're not going to get certainty on these issues. The question is, when have you seen enough cause for concern that you want to take action? And that's where, you know, the U.S. parts ways with much of the rest of the world.
Right. Europe is far ahead of us in terms of when you want to look at this body of evidence and legislate. And they operate on the precautionary principle or precautionary approaches where if the weight of the evidence is pointing in a direction, let's step back and kind of regulate that earlier than later. And they're having challenges implementing that.
They are. But, you know, the other part of it in Europe is that the onus is on the manufacturers to prove that a given chemical is safe. In this country, the onus is on regulators to prove that it's dangerous. And as a result, we have, you know, more than 80,000 chemicals in commerce, 700 new chemicals introduced each year, and since the Toxic Substances Control Act was introduced in 1976, 5 chemicals, that's all, have been banned.
And I always ask people to think about what you were doing in 1976, because as we talked about, the science has evolved quite dramatically in that 36 or so years. So we're not regulating on the basis of some of the newest science.
No, I mean, the EPA is still not really testing for endocrine effects. There's still debate over how to do that, and so, you know, we haven't kept pace with the science.
So we'd love to see that happen. So let me just do a quick time check here. We are at about 4:40 Pacific time. So let's do 2 more questions and then
Okay.
open it up for this audience to ask us some questions. Okay, we're going to jump ahead a little bit. You talk about the social costs of plastic in your book, and you quote someone describing why plastic should be a high-value material. Now, how would our approach to using plastics change if we did view plastic in this way? That it is a material of high value, that it has these social costs, externalities as they call them in the kind of wonky science world, costs in price of, that don't show up in the price of goods or in cost to the environment or cost to labor. How would we flip this on our head if we had a different perspective?
Well, I think I think the key there is that half of all plastics goes to single-use applications. Now, some of those are, valuable applications, but a lot of it is questionable applications, and a lot of it is essentially prefab litter. A lot of it is essentially stuff that ends up in the trash, ends up being buried in landfill, which is insane if you think about how much we spent getting this, these hydrocarbons out of the ground in the first place, or it ends up in the ocean. So I think dealing with the cost of single-use plastics is key. Dealing with the cost of the plastic waste is key. And what I advocate is extended producer responsibility, which is basically saying to the producers, to the brand owners, you made it, you deal with it, and imposing, requiring them to sort of be on the financial hook for it. And we already do that. We do that with bottle bills. Basically, in a state like California that has a bottle bill, we pay an extra nickel for bottles, and Coca-Cola or Pepsi or whoever the brand owner is also pays money to take them back and recycle them. And, you see that it works because in states that have bottle bills, the recycling rates are much higher and the litter rates are way lower. In Europe, again, most countries in Europe have extended producer responsibility laws around packaging. Germany, notably, has the Green Dot Law, which was the first of these, that basically required brand owners and manufacturers to pay into funds that would take care of taking back trash or, paying for ways of getting it back and disposing of it. And as a result, they have much, much higher recycling rates and also much less litter. So I think that's that's the major way of doing it, because it's the single-use stuff where you really are defying the notion that this is valuable, high-value material.
So I think about these bottle bills and these take-backs, and I remember being a really little kid, and Coca-Cola would come in these glass bottles. And I remember my uncle, who was about 16 years older than me, being able to take those back to get the cash back.
Yeah.
Right, so
we did that every week. We would take our soda bottles back to the grocery store. But, the beverage companies have fought bottle bills tooth and nail. So we had 10 states. Delaware just dropped theirs, so now there's only 9 states that have bottle bills, which is insane. It's insane.
And it would seem that these companies could take these bottles back, and it actually becomes a source of income for them. So it's not necessarily that they lose massive amounts of money to be able to do this.
Well, but they have to pay for it. I mean, it's a funny thing because you get very mushy answers when you ask beverage companies why they don't support bottle bills. They say, well, we don't want to be singled out. Why should we be singled out? And they're right. I mean, bottles aren't the only source of trash. It would be great if, chip bags, if every kind of packaging had some sort of EPR associated with it. And then you would have sort of a nice fund for really getting recycling going, because right now the recycling infrastructure in this country is pretty lousy, and we recycle less than 10% of all plastic.
We're very lucky here in the Bay Area because we have, what's the, company that does our recycling, we have the highest rate of reuse in this area in the whole country, right?
We have a high rate. I don't know if it's the highest in the country, but, San Francisco has a zero waste policy. So that policy enacted by the city, sort of is a goad to keep improving recovery and recycling.
certainly notice the difference when I go from here to my hometown in Kansas, where it's a lot harder,
Yeah.
and they do have curbside, luckily, but
Yeah.
it's a lot more work to separate stuff out and
Oh, yeah.
and have the right system.
I was in Texas, and there, recycling, you know, so you have to take it to a recycling place, and I talked to a woman who was fighting for a bottle bill there, and she said she had to drive 15 minutes to take her stuff to a recycling center, which is really wacky because, you know, how much gas are you using so that you can go and recycle your bottles? I mean, it just, you know, it was great that she was doing it, but it doesn't make sense on a sort of broad policy basis.
Right, right. So before we open to questions and how folks are doing on the sound, if folks are listening in and either looking for where to start reducing their use of plastics, especially single-use ones as you talk about, or maybe we have some, I think we have some pretty savvy people on the phone, but they're looking at, like, what's the one thing that they can sell to their friends and family? Where would you say to start making some of those, what's the lowest hanging fruit?
Well, the lowest hanging fruit is plastic bags. I mean, there's a reason why there's been so much fight over bags, because it's just, it really is an unnecessary thing. It's you know, this ubiquitous consumer item. We consume billions of them, and, you know, it's really easy to replace. And in San Francisco, we did the bag ban in 2007. We just modified it to put a 10-cent fee on paper bags, and I'm really seeing the difference in stores. So that's low-hanging fruit, you know, bringing your own coffee cup, not taking straws, which is harder than you would think, but
that's true.
Yeah.
It is true. People look at you like you're a little crazy when you say, I don't want the straw.
Well, it's really hard to stop them. I mean, a lot of times it comes before you get a chance to say, no. But those kinds of things, you know, looking at you know, around foodware, that's an easy one. Then it starts to get a little tougher, you know, looking at remembering to, you know, buying in bulk, trying to buy in bulk, and you know, bringing your own bags or your own containers to buy in bulk. And, you know, from there it starts to get tougher. I'm not hardcore. There are people who are much more hardcore who make their own shampoo and soap and deodorant, and I don't do that, but those are things you can do.
Right.
You know, we've lived without plastic for a long time. It's in my own lifetime that it has become just so pervasive. So, you know, we could go back and live pretty happily without a lot of this stuff.
If it were still made or available.
Yeah, yeah.
Are there some things that you would say we absolutely need to keep plastic for?
Well, you know, I don't think we want to get plastic out of medicine. I don't think, you know, and there are single-use plastics in medicine that make sense, like disposable syringes. Plastics are really important in transportation if we want to have lighter weight cars and airplanes. We need plastic. I like my plastic glasses. I don't have a problem with synthetic fibers. I actually think they're, you know, a lot of them are good because, you know, we don't want to be growing. Cotton is not a great product and not a great crop. Plastics in durable applications are great materials. I think my last slide is, this is my example. This is my example of one of the world's worst kinds of packaging. And I love it because Jon Stewart said this is like for people who love bananas but hate the biodegradability of the skin. But goes past this. Yeah, this is I always talk about this. I wrote about this in the book. This is a bridge that was built by this company that has figured out how to take milk jugs and car bumpers, mush them together, and make these incredibly tough, like I-beams and you know, 2x4s, I guess, or whatever. And, you know, this is a bridge that's strong enough to hold an M1 Abrams tank. In those kinds of applications, plastics are fantastic. You know, it's going to last. That thing is going to be there for a really long time. And it's not going to corrode. It's not going to need to be treated with any sort of chemical.
And that's a reuse of...
Yeah, and that's a reuse. And, you know, some people would look at that and say it's downcycling, but, you know, I don't think so. I think that's going to be there a long time.
So there are creative ways we can close the loop on these single uses where we extract use and then just throw it out,
Right.
where we can find a new use for it or get it back in the same cycle where
Right,
it was.
right. I think, I don't think everything has to be a neatly closed loop exactly back to where it is. That's not realistic. It's not possible, with some plastics. But if you can put them into durable uses like this, or put them into new uses that can, have a longer lifespan than just one or two uses, that's great too.
So it kind of is reduce, reuse, recycle, but on a grander scale than what we think about one-on-one, right?
Yeah.
We want to reduce, like, the single plastic bags and maybe, like, our plastic bottles, but then we can reuse those plastics in different sources and close some loops in creative ways.
Yeah. I forgot plastic water bottles. That's definitely something you can get rid of.
So, it looks like we have a couple of questions coming in, and we have about 10 minutes left, so if folks want to start chatting some questions our way. I'm scooting closer to the computer so I can see them. And I have a feeling people are going to ask us some hard questions, so we'll see what we can do here.
Okay.
So, as someone who works in retail, how can we find truly safe products, especially those marketed safe, for instance, as BPA-free, whereas they may have something else in them and we don't know what that is.
Yeah.
So, I'll talk to that one a little bit because that's with our Cans Not Cancer project here. We've been working on that a lot, where we want to see BPA in food cans replaced with something safer. Well, we know that some companies are starting to make moves toward that, and certainly Eden Foods is using oleo rosin, which is a plant-based material. But there are more traditional companies, like Campbell's told us, in response to some consumer pressure, that they were phasing out the BPA, but they're not telling us what they're replacing it with. So if we don't know what it is, we really can't analyze whether it is safer or not. And so when we pass policies, like there's the BPA Act, which was the Ban Poisonous Additives Act, that in the House, in the Senate that is winding down in the next couple of months, called for the determination that alternatives being used to replace BPA were safe and not endocrine disruptors, et cetera, et cetera. In the Senate, that same bill was only applicable to infant and toddler food items, but of course, infants and toddlers eat things like canned foods that adults eat too. So seeing some of those changes where we not only talk in legislation about getting rid of the bad things, but talk about adding in new things is essential, and that's not going to happen necessarily overnight, but we have to stay on that requirement that alternatives are safe. And going back to what we talked about earlier, pass comprehensive chemicals policy reform that really ensures that any chemicals that are in our stream, our industrial stream, are actually safer.
Yeah, I mean, this is the one issue that I just think people can't shop their way out of. And we can't, it's very hard to deal with this issue on an individual level. It really is a policy level issue because unless manufacturers are required to make safe chemicals, we really don't have any way of knowing what's in them.
So in the meantime, to answer your question, because that's not necessarily a super great answer for the retail, going with the stainless steel, going with more traditional
glass and stainless steel are safe. There are plastics too that, polypropylene is a fairly clean plastic. That's the number 5 plastic. Polyethylene is generally a fairly clean plastic. And there's a company in Texas that is, and I'm blanking on their name, that is making additive-free plastics.
Plastipure.
Plastipure.
Right. So they're making the plastics without, some of the additives that they put in to give different properties can have estrogenic, even if the base plastic is super good. And you can email me or Susan, and we can talk to you more about that kind of detail. Let's see what else we have. Let's see. Okay, so someone is surprised at the support of plastic, thinking from from a consumer level, we need to be educated on the subject and reduce, not just reuse. So, what do we want to clarify there with,
well, I think
kind of where we're staying?
I guess my position is you're not going to get rid of plastic, and we don't want to get rid of plastic. But I agree, reduce is the most important thing. Finding ways to, reduce the amount of plastic that we consume is important. I think that's where I think finding ways to not use single-use plastics gets at that. I'm not sure I completely understand the question.
So I think, that move away from, especially with the single-use plastics, if that's 50% of the stream that we're picking up off a shelf one time, using it and throwing it, whether it's in a recycling bin, where hopefully something good happens to it, or where it ends up in a landfill. And I don't know, it's a large proportion of those bottles and bags that don't end up recycled, right?
Well, the bottles are the most recycled things, but in this country, even that, number one, plastics like the PET that's used in water bottles and soda bottles, that's still 70% of those end up in landfill.
So I think we're in total agreement that let's absolutely dramatically reduce our use of those, because that is a huge stream, and that would take care of 50% of it.
Well, no, because that single use includes some things that we like, but it would take it if you stopped using single use plastics, it would dramatically reduce the amount of plastics we consume.
Mm-hmm. So let's see. For foods, why not encourage the use of glass? Foods taste better in glass.
Okay, so this is, it's all trade-offs. We don't live in a perfect world. What plastics have going for them is they're lightweight. So, I'm not defending plastics here because I think there's a lot of excessive packaging, but
like the bananas.
Yeah, like the bananas. But let's take something like a mayonnaise jar. You could have it in plastic, or you could have it in glass. Well, glass is going to be a lot heavier to transport. It's going to be very energy intensive to produce. So is your concern global warming? Is your concern, use of energy? Is your concern pollution and, potential additives? Both. It's a devil's set of choices. I mean, unfortunately, we live in an imperfect world. I'm not opposed to plastics in packaging. I'm opposed to unsafe plastics that leach bad chemicals into my food, and I'm opposed to plastics that don't get recycled or reused, or are just plain stupid, like the banana wrapped in plastic. And there may be places where it makes sense to use glass, but there are some reasonable reasons that plastic replaced glass.
And I know that when we're looking at asking companies to do an alternatives assessment, they are weighing, the plastic cost plus the plastic transportation cost plus the glass cost. And for different products, I would imagine you come up with sort of a different arithmetic for how to make that decision. So,
as much as possible, I think, what's best is to sort of try to find things that you don't have to buy packaged.
Right, yeah. So move away from.
Produce, you don't have to buy produce in packages. You don't have to buy, we're blessed in California to have fresh produce pretty much year-round, but, you don't necessarily have to buy your meat wrapped in plastic wrap sitting on a styrofoam tray. Unless you want to make your own mayonnaise, you probably have to buy it in some kind of container.
Right. It does always surprise me when I walk into a supermarket and I see someone going through with their produce and they have like 15 different plastic bags, one for every different kind of food, and I just throw mine all into my canvas bag and they're happy they're together. The lettuce just fine next to the tomatoes,
They don't fight.
So there are some definite smart choices to make there.
I think the problem, I think what ends up happening, I came out of working on the book feeling like we don't live in a perfect world. We are continually confronted with trade-offs, so we have to just be conscious and mindful when we are acting as consumers and think about what the trade-offs are, which trade-off we want to make.
And I do think that advocates and consumers have a role to play in holding companies accountable for choosing the alternatives that really are the smartest for our environment in all of those ranges of outcomes.
Absolutely.
Because that moves forward the innovation that does fix plastics that have bad additives or that can't be recycled, or that transportation costs are extreme.
Yeah.
Right? They used to bottle sodas locally because it was expensive to, well, maybe that's an alternative that can be considered, right?
Yeah.
And we don't have to transport them across the whole country.
Right, right.
So there's a lot of creative thinking that us as consumers, I think, can shape the movement. This is a great question. Is there a way for these chemicals to be eliminated or reduced in the body once they're already there? So some chemicals stay in the body for a long time, but many, phthalates and BPA, which you talked about.
But you guys did the study showing that 3 days of plastic-free eating dramatically reduced people's, if you really reduce the amount of food that comes into contact with plastic, it dramatically reduced phthalate and BPA levels.
We worked with our colleagues at the Silent Spring Institute, and we had this amazing caterer at Greenheart Foods who prepared 3 days of foods for our families, 5 families that agreed to participate. And they were all families of 4 with kids, so we thought in adults and grown-up and kids, where they did have yogurt and polypropylene. We knew that wasn't going to have DHP. Right. And otherwise, all of their food was home prepared from fresh grains and vegetables and whatever, packaged in glass containers, and we measured their BPA and phthalate levels before they did that, and then they flushed for about 48 hours. We measured it during that special diet, and then after, and we saw a perfect V for BPA, which was about a 66% drop on average, and 75% for the families with the highest levels, and then DHP was about a 50% drop. Yeah. And it was harder to figure out where the DHP was coming from, but it's probably further upstream in food processing. Yeah. Was our suspicion. So you really can get those out of your body pretty quickly because their natural way of leaving is BPA is probably gone in 12 to 18 hours for most of us, and phthalates are about double that. So those are chemicals where we really can see a dramatic change, and where if you think about policies that would change that, because not everybody can pop to the grocery store and buy what we can buy. If they only have a convenience food store in their neighborhood, or most of their foods that are easily available are packaged, they're not going to have that possibility. I mean,
the FDA does a bad job of regulating chemical additives in food packaging. That's another area where policy change is really badly needed.
We need to move that regulation and that testing into this 21st century so that we see those things change across the board, because some of us can kind of avoid that, but not everyone. So I think we'll do one more question. This is a great one. Do we know of any efforts in the healthcare industry to reduce chemical exposure from plastics, and I would think also plastic additives among patients? So we know that kids in the NICU, infants in the NICU, have really high levels of BPA, and the DHP and PVC and syringes are issues.
Well, there's been a group that's been working on this for actually longer than several years, called Healthcare Without Harm, really trying to push hospitals to get PVC, vinyl, out of healthcare. And Kaiser, just in the last year, announced that they were going completely vinyl-free, and have successfully done that on everything from, small things to the flooring or the wallpaper, the medical devices. There's an effort to do it. The problem is that in some cases substitutes don't always exist. So for instance, I talked about the blood bag. Blood bankers do not want to give up vinyl blood bags. But a growing number of hospitals are looking at this issue and trying to do it, and really the issue is, you know, whether they can find substitutes and whether they can find affordable substitutes, which aren't always available.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, so I think we're out of time. I want to wrap. I want to thank you so much for coming
Thank
all the
you.
way to our offices to be here for this, and,
Thank
and
you.
for writing your really fabulous book. Folks who are on the line who haven't read it, it really is a very entertaining and fascinating read. So jump in there and get it.
Thank you.
And we are, this is a recorded webinar, so we will be processing this in the way that you have to process these things and getting it up on our website in the next week or so, hopefully sooner. And I'll be sending everyone out an email, including those who are on the line and those who couldn't make it, so they can find that link, breastcancerfund.org/webinars. And yes, we are. I got just a note that the sound was a bit out of sync. Yeah, that service is just not perfect, unfortunately. And so we'll be announcing further Prevention Speaks web chats in the future with additional authors, as well as trainings that we do on what the Breast Cancer Fund does and the science behind it. So thank you again.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.